Welcome to today's GovFocus, presented by GovCIO Media and Research, where we have two subject matter experts discussing how to develop a secure API-led approach to data strategy. I'm your moderator, Kate Macri, and joining me today are Major General John Olson, Chief Data and Artificial Intelligence Officer for the Department of the Air Force, and Chris Borneman, Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Software AG Government Solutions. So to start off our conversation today, I have a question for both of you. I'm curious how you see APIs maximizing secure interoperability for complex data sets and complex data efforts, such as the Defense Department's Joint All-Domain Command and Control Initiative. And I'm interested in what challenges you foresee here. So, General Olson, do you want to start off with this one?
Well, sure. Well, thank you. It's a great question, and it's really at the core of everything that we're doing, not just for Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2, and in particular for the Department of the Air Force. Our approach to that is called the Advanced Battle Management System, but we're working closely with Project Convergence and Project Overmatch for the Army and the Navy, respectively. But, as I am the Chief Data and AI Officer for the Department of the Air Force, one of the things that we operate is the Department of the Air Force Data Fabric, or the DAF Data Fabric. And so it's vital. It has 6 big data platforms. Those are Elixir, Cygnus, Unified Data Library. We also have Blade, which runs on Advana, Envision, and Vault. And collectively, those 6 big data platforms, it's fundamentally important that we have pipelines and API interfaces between it. So that's how we operate and manage our DAF data fabric. And so as we look at the applications of that access, that ready, responsive access to authoritative data, we are fundamentally dependent upon APIs in a secure environment to link all those together. As we look at Joint All-Domain Command and Control, it's really at its simplest definition, it's the ability to sense, make sense, and act across all the domains, and that's air, sea, land, cyberspace, and subsurface. It is the ability to sense, make sense, and act across all domains, across all the joint services in a contested environment at the speed of relevance. And to do that, we have to have machine-to-machine speed, and we have to have absolutely trusted and very resilient and effective ability to access our data and information. And so whether it's the edge or all the way to the core, it's fundamentally important to everything that we do. And given that we expect to have a very capable economically and militarily adversary or set of adversaries, doing so in a secure environment is total and essential foundation for us.
Chris, would love to get your perspective on this as well.
Okay, well, I think the general outlined, kind of like the big problem statement there, right? It's a broad set of capabilities, but it's its own inherent challenges to it. And I think that the thing I would add into it, just as an extra challenge, is looking at it not just for today, but how does that evolve over time? What we have today is definitely going to change, right? Especially if you think about it from a government perspective, our systems have historically been tied to legacy. We put a lot of time into the build, and then we convert on over into a sustainment approach. But what's being envisioned here needs to be something that it's in a continuous build, continuously evolving to be able to keep up with the threats. And so I think there's just a little bit added challenges to consider that this unique space has. So making sure that we have good approaches for that.
And Kate, I think Chris nailed it. As we talk about this, we're never done with JADC2. JADC2 isn't a program. It's a concept, and it's a capability that is going to evolve. And we like to say the only change is constant here. And so as we build that in, we're looking at open systems architecture. This is a systems approach. underpinning it all, we must have a DevSecOps approach. We must have zero trust and ICAM capabilities so that we have both at the data and the user level, the ability to allow our whether it's our joint services, whether it's industry and academia, or importantly, our international partners and allies. And so as we look at that, these are the table stakes or the foundational elements, but it is going to be something that evolves constantly. And as the challenges and the threat and the opportunities unfold, we want to make sure we can harness those fully, don't have any type of vendor lock, don't have any single type of single point vulnerability. As those threat surfaces increase, we too want to be able to scale and have a dynamic and a layered and a multi-pronged approach. So Chris nailed it right on.
Awesome. So that actually sets up my next question perfectly for Chris. Chris, what kind of data prep or groundwork do organizations such as DoD need to do to get ready for APIs? General Olson mentioned DevSecOps and zero trust. What kind of data work has to be done in order to get to that point?
Yeah. So I think first off, is really around the overall plan. And what I've been really impressed with is, if anyone hasn't read it, is go back and look at the DoD Data Strategy. It came out, September, October of 2020. I found that to be a very good read, a very good broad approach, but setting the guidelines, looking at a program as broad as the DoD and all the commands and programs there within it, you need to have that overarching framework. And so then if you start looking at it, deeper inside of that, I think the approach that I would take, and I've heard this from some of our various government customers that have kind of a security responsibility, is they're really taking an enterprise architecture approach. What all do I have? Because it is a systems approach when you start looking at this thing. You're not in a small confined program. And so you need to really understand where all your components and where those exist, and really what types of data are you exchanging. Getting into data tagging later on, and how do you do your secure sharing? You really know what all that involves. And then the other thing that I always kind of hold near and dear is that when we talk about our APIs, behind every API to me is a great integration story, right? An API by itself, you can have APIs that do some calculations, et cetera, but most APIs, they're really talking about interfacing back into some sort of source of data, and some sort of record of authority, and that those may be legacy systems. We're looking at government. As we talked about just a little bit ago, there's a ton of legacy systems out there, and to create those APIs to go through and share that data, you really have to go through and have a good, solid integration approach to be able to get to it from an application perspective, at a pure raw data perspective. As we are definitely emerging, evolving, especially with JADC2, you start looking at real-time, at the edge, and your IoT and various sensor data coming into it, something totally new. You've got to have a great integration story, I think, to pull it all together.
I actually wanted to follow up on something you said about legacy systems. What do you see as some of the challenges around legacy systems, especially when it comes to trying to bridge some data interoperability gaps between legacy systems and, say, the cloud?
Okay, yeah. So tons of challenges associated with it, I think, are can be overcome. Most legacy systems, they probably have some sort of API, and by API, I'm using in the broadest, definition, application programming interface, not necessarily what we, be doing with a REST protocol or anything modern today off of a cloud. They have some way, whether it's dumping files, importing files, or something. They have some way to get data in and out. So you need to go figure out, how do you want to go and get that data? And then, what I was looking for is, how do I do that securely? Is it really going to be a file dump that I have to now worry about, these exports? If you look at, several years ago, it's great, it's in the past, but the OPM data breach a long time ago from the mainframe had nothing to do with the mainframe, and everything with dumping data, to a file system to then go through and process and do various things. And it was that dump that got hacked. So how do you do that securely, to your backend legacy systems? So there's definitely some great techniques to go through and do that. But then you're taking systems that may not be used to operating at cloud speed, cloud frequency. So how do I go through introduce caching, et cetera? So there's various techniques that you can use. We've got customers who have exposed all the way back to the mainframe and exposed it onto the web. At a state level, we could talk about, the Virginia DMV for those that live in Virginia. And it's got a great online interface to interact with what your vehicles are and your driver license. Everything behind that is a mainframe. But you've got real-time exposure all the way up to the cloud. So there's definitely good ways to go through and do it. There's definitely some things you probably would want to avoid, but I would look at how you do your integration approach to those legacy systems rather than rip and replace, throwing it all out to go build something new because you want to get a new interface. And that's definitely the way I would avoid.
Gotcha.
And Kate, kind of taking that as a tip and a cue, I think Chris gave two great examples with the OPM hack and the Virginia DMV. But when we scale that, I really think JADC2 is like one of the quintessential or the really most stressing cases for an operational application at a tremendously complex and vast scale. As we look at the Department of Defense writ large, certainly we have a huge annual appropriation, but as we look at our huge cachet of legacy systems, we simply don't have enough in the national budget or the annual appropriation to do, as Chris said, is to start fresh and baseline everything. So from legacy systems integration to the most cutting edge and enabling and new and evolving capabilities, we need to stitch those all together. And so we're actually building the airplane while we're flying it, and it's not just a glider. This is a supersonic or hypersonic, because that's the speed at which analogously we need to operate here. So when we look at this is precisely how we bring this systems of systems, this broad set of legacy systems, and then certainly in each of the services. We've had solutions in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Space Force evolving at different rates and paces, stitching those together in a seamless, interoperable way. It really is about integration and interoperability. And so as we drive those, APIs form the absolute critical element of that. But we also, in a secure environment, we also need to have not just that primary approach. We need to think of a full pace approach, primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency, because we expect to have degraded environments. We expect to have challenges with bandwidth and connectivity. And those are going to be part of this near peer or peer adversarial environment. So as we look at this, APIs are a fundamental enabler. And finally, I think as we look at the complexity, it is an Internet of Things, but we're going to be leveraging airborne edge nodes, space edge nodes. We're going to be leveraging all the connectivity, different waveforms. We're going to be leveraging 5G and NextG and across the electromagnetic spectrum, plus cable and fiber. So as we look at that, it's got to be a robust enough solution, and its core APIs, or like Chris was saying, application program interfaces, are simply just a software intermediary that allows two different applications to talk together, and we need to do that in a seamless, responsive, resilient, and effective way.
Absolutely. So my next question is for you, General Olson. How do you see APIs working in tandem with other emerging technologies such as AI, ML, deep learning as well at the Department of the Air Force? And I feel like you were starting to get into this a little bit. So if you want to continue that thought.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to expand a little bit. Simply put, we talked about JADC2 and ABMS. It is in order to make sense, act, or said another way, observe, orient, decide, or act, the standard OODA loop, or we also call that the kill chain. The times against in the modern environment, whether it's integrated deterrence or crisis or combat or conflict, as we look across that spectrum of conflict, we need to be able to have machine-to-machine speed in order to operate at the speed of relevance or the speed of need. And so as we look at this, really we know that about 80 to 85% of AI or artificial intelligence, machine learning, ML, or deep learning, DL, is data wrangling, data formatting. And so it's really hard work. It involves metadata tagging, formatting, cleansing, structuring. And this has to go across not just structured, but semi-structured and unstructured data, data at rest, data in motion. So as we strive to make data have those vaultus attributes, and that's a common mnemonic for visible, accessible, understandable, linked, trustworthy, interoperable, and secure vaultus. To have that authoritative data and access at the speed of need, it is fundamentally important that we focus on the data first to make and empower the AI, ML, DL solutions. But we are indeed doing so, and we're applying that at a rate and pace and a level of scale that's ever increasing. We've got a lot of work to do. We're looking to partner with industry. We're looking to partner with academia, and of course, partner across the services and with our partners and allies and friends in the international community. It is really a whole of government approach. But nevertheless, as we focus on that, APIs and the secure interoperability, interconnectivity is fundamentally important. But at the same time, to make all that work, we also are thinking about it both from a defensive and an offensive side. So protecting our training data sets, protecting our algorithms, making sure that we have data catalogs, making sure that we have metadata tagging strategies that are standardized. So within the Department of the Air Force, we really amplify and implement the OSD CDAO, or Chief Digital and AI Office, guidelines. So that's how we work it. We have the top-down approach. We expand that for our unique airspace and cyber domain capabilities across the Department of the Air Force, and we get it done together.
So, General Olson, you've said that DoD can't have the same exact data standards across every component, combatant command, and service branch. Can APIs help bridge the gap between different data sets with different data standards and help facilitate more of a systems to systems approach?
Well, yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I think just to clarify the statement, I think we realistically will never have the exact same data standards. However, we are driving through OSD guidance and amplification towards common interoperability. But I think APIs are exactly the mechanism by which we are going to make our seamless connectivity across the enterprise architecture. And I do see this. My PhD is in systems engineering, and I think as we look at this big, challenging, audacious, tough, complex, multifaceted problem that continuously evolves, the only way we can do that is to break that into bite-sized, manageable pieces and leverages the tools and the capabilities. So again, the table stakes are DevSecOps approach. Security can't be bolted on. We absolutely need zero trust and ICAM, fundamentally important at the data and user level. A data fabric, fundamentally important. APIs, very, very critical to everything that we do. So that's how I see it all stitching together. I would say right now, we have the best relationship we've ever had in terms of interoperability with the Department of the Navy and the Department of the Air Force. That's 4/5 of the services. I think as we leverage as we leverage and expand that further, as we tie in with the Army, Project Convergence is a great opportunity to, as the Army says, get out in the dirt and test and refine and learn as we go along, because the practical application, the min viable product approach to having operational capability is so essential. Because when you think about it, we have to be prepared, not just ready to fight tonight, but to fight right now. And this is in competition across the gray zone, all the way to the high-end modern peer-to-peer conflict and engagement. So that's the kind of approach and mindset with which we're bringing to this.
Chris, what's your perspective on this? How can APIs extend secure data sharing inside and outside an organization like DoD and across its supply chain?
Sure. So, I mean, the one thing I would just go back to, which Olson had said that I picked out. There's a ton there, but as it relates to this, I really thought that the comment around, the components and the integrations, right? So it's not one massive system, right, that you're waiting on. It's how do you handle each of the bits and the pieces to be able to bring this together from a systems to systems approach. To me, is absolutely spot on, right? It lets you have the flexibility you need where you need it, rather than waiting for the next, annual release of something, right? So security has to be baked into that approach. When we look outside of organization in terms of data sharing, there's a security aspect, but to me, there's also the discovery aspect. So having a really good approach for discovery and doing it from a zero trust, you don't want to put out your inventory of here's everything I have to everybody and then just secure it when they call it. You really want to secure what do you want to tell people about, so they even control it, constrain it at the discovery side. So that always, from a zero trust, it starts out with even authenticating the discovery phase, right? But there's no one master list. So again, how do you take an approach that you can have a standardized way of describing what your capabilities are, so that you have the interoperability across all the different programs, as well as outside industry. And then, secondly, I'll look at that authorization and control scope to monitor your consumption. So not just, what do I have and how do I authorize consumers of those APIs, but, what is actually getting used? There's intelligence you can gather based off of what data people are asking for. Now, I was at a conference last year, or maybe I guess it's probably earlier this year. And just the emphasis that they had on supply chain routes within the UK or within the Ukraine, a couple of years ago, versus now is completely different. But maybe get an indication as to who started looking at information before something emerged might have been a good indicator, just a change in who's analyzing what. So understanding your authorization and scope and consumption side. The other piece on APIs that I would look at that can really help in the data sharing is you can create virtualized APIs. So we'd look at the interoperability. No one will have one single standard, but as you go through and try and stitch these pieces together, having a standard for that is something you definitely want to go through and encourage. So if you have something at legacy that maybe it's a SOAP interface, can you just create a virtual API around it to make it rest, to make it work with tools that are being built out, deployed that kind of assume a more modern REST interface to it? Wouldn't require any extra code. You don't have any massive amount of maintenance associated to it. But creating those API layer to do that and do it in a non-programmatic way, no code way, definitely can go through and help and encourage that data sharing across your supply chain side. And then I would say that, combine that with advanced API integration techniques, right? So, we talked about how do I, have a great story behind every API. There's an integration story. So how do I get back? Use even that mainframe example. You definitely want to make sure you have that for that outside the organization approach. And then I think that on the governance of data, especially when you look at like pace, is everything going to be an API, or will I have to have edge repositories depending on what my speed of need might be? Those data concentrators can do a lot too to normalize data as it comes into central repositories, and the vast number of systems that were mentioned earlier on the data fabric side. Those can do a lot of the control. When I start gathering data and put it together, I can do a lot of that like for like to make it easier to go through and do analytics.
Awesome. So I've got one more question for you guys before we wrap up today. Are there any unique security risks to APIs that organizations should consider when deploying an API strategy? And do you think APIs overall dovetail with security approaches such as zero trust? Chris, do you want to start with you?
Sure. So when we look at API strategy, the implementation thereof, I think, is important to look at what your techniques are going to be. So I've heard from some different organizations that are, they've done a set of API standards and say, this is how we're going to code. We're going to code to the standard and everything will be the same. And I've worked with other organizations that have taken a platform approach to their APIs to go through and say, we're going to do the API portion. And they might be doing no code tools, low code tools. They might just, coding something up in Java, but they've made the choice that they'll let an API platform take care of the rest. So they don't code for security per se inside of their own components. They allow the platform to then layer on that. And the reason for that is that they recognize that what your security needs are today are going to evolve. And so you don't want to rely on code or configuration. You really want to be at a policy level that could change today, not tonight, not tomorrow, but if your needs change, identify a threat, how can I close that threat through a change in a policy that pushes out across everything? And especially when we look at all those various programs that are in sustainment, where getting it on the schedule to go make a change later on might take, maybe impossible, maybe a really long time. How could I affect that at a policy level from the platform and do that across the board with those legacy systems, current development, et cetera? So I think that, your approach on your strategy as you look at as implemented by makes a really big difference if you think about that up front. I think that one of our customers has come back to us and they had said that just by doing this alone, they save 50% of their development time. Right. So it's not a bad thing to do this properly. You get a benefit on the long term, but you can also get benefit very much at the front side of it. The other piece, when you look at that as implemented API strategy approach, would be looking at, General actually said this as well, is that open, platform perspective. So we've had customers, using that open approach where they're trying to do the API security. They've got a zero trust, footprint, and they've got all this great security that the platform can go through and do, but they recognize that the security on one API is never as good as looking at the family of APIs or even just the entire ecosystem. So can I add machine learning into all the various APIs and start stitching together that there's a bad actor out there who is systematically going through various APIs that on their own may not be that bad, but stitched together creates an exploit. And so you can apply machine learning across that on a much broader basis. And you can do that if you've got a good open platform. The other feedback that we've gotten from customers is the number of APIs that they find out that they had that they never even knew existed. So taking your approach on your API, not just purely top down, but how do you do like a bottom up and do a discovery? What do I really have versus what my documentation says versus what's installed inside my environment can really yield a big benefit. And that all to me really aligns back into your zero trust.
Awesome. General Olson.
And Kate, I thought that was a great answer. I thought Chris touched all the bases. Essentially, to repackage and redistill that. I mean, you needed a full spectrum approach with a focus on evolutions and changes in policy and strategy and capability. One that can evolve throughout time and as adversary threats and opportunities also evolve. We have 26 software factories organically within the Department of the Air Force. That's a great capability to help us react and respond more briskly and more effectively. But at the same time, this is a fundamental partnership with industry and academia. As I look at Advanced Battle Management System, our DAF RCO, our Rapid Capabilities Office, currently is the integrating PEO and the lead for that. They brought on over 200 companies into an IDIQ contract so that we can rapidly tap the best and brightest across the industry spectrum. Similarly, as we look at the digital infrastructure, one of our early top 3 acquisition thrusts, as we look at that for the digital infrastructure or the digital infrastructure industry consortium, we had 30 companies and we distilled that down to 7 in that industry consortium. So we're getting that diversity, that richness, that strength of the industrial base, that strength of the innovative, creative, entrepreneurial capacity, and we're leveraging that. But it's also fundamentally important within the Department of the Air Force, within the Department of Defense writ large, as well as in our public-private partnerships here, that we have a digital-focused culture, one of continuous process improvement, one that's looking and focusing on DevSecOps, whether that's DevSecOps in everything that we do, and even applying it to the DevSecOps approach to AI, that full spectrum security, taking an engineering ecosystem or a digital engineering ecosystem, digital headquarters, digital operations, and digital workforce. All of that is fundamentally important to ensuring that we have the cultural and the organizational foundations to really apply these tools at the pace and rate necessary. So again, full spectrum approach. I love Chris's answer, and I think as we look to go forward, this is the time where we got to harness that whole of nation approach, because it is fundamentally the way that we apply and employ our integrated deterrence and our forces and capabilities and postures to carry out the integrated deterrence and national defense and national security of our nation.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for joining me on today's GovFocus. These comments and discussion were amazing, and I think that's all the time we have for today.